welcome back to our second episode of Rooted and Restored. I'm here with my stepdaughter, Callie. My name's Lisa Rowe, and we're excited to be chatting with you today about relationships. And Callie, you get to be the interviewer, if you will, today, and kind of just maybe put me into maybe the answering your questions position. And so I'm excited for what that looks like today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think that if I can remember properly, I feel like through our time together, you have been a space of like modeling what a relationship looks like in the highs and lows, but you've also been a place for me to like ask questions or explore things so I can see what a healthy relationship looks like, what it looks like to repair right after having a rupture in a relationship. So I feel like that's kind of what today's going to feel like a little bit.
Awesome.
Because we kind of have those conversations sometimes.
That's right. And so it could be that we're talking about intimate partner relationships, perhaps, or it could be we're talking about friendships or family relationships. I think that a lot of the things that we might chat about today kind of can apply to all relationships because there are some common themes, right? Maybe they shift and flow depending on if you're in a sexual relationship or there's maybe a power differential with a mother and a daughter or a father and a son or whatever that looks like. But overall, the basic foundations of relationships kind of apply. And we address that at Rooted, right? And we talk about what it takes to be in a healthy relationship. And what it really looks like is, are you your healthiest self? And when you are your healthiest self, you can offer availability to a healthy relationship, and you can also have the availability to have a mechanism inside of you to know when things don't feel right and maybe the other person isn't healthy for you or doesn't match your values and those sort of things. So I hope to really unpack that with you today as we kind of delve into what that looks like.
Yeah. So I feel like first setting the stage, like I know we said we can talk about all different realms of relationships, but I think kind of like getting like a little bit of a history of like, you're married right now, right? What's that look like? How long have you been married? And kind of just getting like the basis of setting that up.
It's really cool. So I've been married to your dad for 10 years. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, and we dated probably for 2 years prior to that. So I've been in the relationship with Daddy for 12 years. And then prior to that, I was married and divorced, and I had 2 children in that relationship. I'm sure that we'll just talk about what it's like to have had, you called it ruptures in relationships before, because it also dates back to my experience as a child, having lived through divorce. My parents divorced when I was 9, and living through what that looked like shaped a lot of my understanding, a lot of unhealed wounds that I brought into my adult life that I'm sure we'll unpack at some level today.
How does it feel to say that like you've been married for 10 years?
It's a big question. A really big deal, because part of the mechanism that I grew up with from all the dysfunction I experienced was to run away from things. And so when things get hard, I often, prior to healing, would exit left, exit right, find something different, shinier, whatever it is. And so to be able to say that, right, sitting here with you and to be able to say that I've been married for 10 years in a relationship with Dad for 12, I mean, we've experienced a lot of ups and downs. We brought a lot of baggage into this relationship, and gosh, it just seems like it has really helped me in my recovery journey and my healing journey, but it's pretty amazing to be able to answer that question today.
I think like even when I reflect on like every time you guys have an anniversary, I'm like, whoa, they've been married for like a long time. And I think the only other person like I can relate to is like my grandma and my grandpa had been married for a long time together, but like he passed away a while ago. So I feel like I wasn't as aware, perceptive to some of those things, nor did I ask questions, where like you've opened a space for me to be able to ask questions, since I have seen a lot of dysfunction, to kind of get curious about things so I can learn like through what you're experiencing and as you learn too, which I think is a great thing. But going back to like me, like even when I'm like, whoa, they've been married for 10 years, like that's crazy. So like I can't even imagine like how it feels like embodying that for yourself.
Yeah, and just to turn the tables for a second, does it feel interesting for you to be able to say that, having lived through it?
Touche. Yeah, I would say yeah. Because I feel like I've also been programmed, I think, to see like really big scary things happen or ruptures, right, in relationships, and what people do is they run from it or they leave, right? So I've seen you and Dad have ruptures and you fight really hard through it. From a kid perspective, sometimes I'm like, whoa, I don't understand that. But seeing like how you can come out on the other side and be stronger, like, not to go in detail, but like you guys had a rupture like a few like weeks ago, right? And then like I would say, like, since then, like, outside perspective looking in, like, you guys have seemed really great recently. So, like, obviously outside perspective. But it's cool to see, like, how you can have hardships happen in relationships and you can choose to sit in the discomfort and grow from it. Because I think a lot of people are taught to flee away from it. Or if something's really hard, you don't fight for it. Obviously, there's, like, ramifications within that, because sometimes you do have to leave, right? And it isn't safe for you to still fight for what it is, but learning what that looks like and what's healthy to stay and what's unhealthy to stay in romantic relationships, friendships, family relationships, all of them.
That's a good point. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because what you're pointing out, I can relate to. Having been a child in dysfunction, right? And not knowing, I didn't have language for a lot of the things that were happening. My parents weren't nearly as connected to their healing experience at that time. And so just to be able for you to be able to say, like, yeah, you guys had a like major fight coming home from a vacation. And it was contained in a car. It was terrible. But yeah, Dad and I have resources now to help us walk through that. And you were awesome too, because you did something I would have never been able to do in saying, hey guys, you need to stop this and let us out and let us have this, like, you guys have this space, which I never could have done that as a kid. So all of that to say that what I saw was run away, right? You're seeing a little bit of a different thing. And I think that's what's missing from our society, is that I don't think we are seeing enough of what it looks like in relationships to work through things, to talk about things, to navigate discomfort, to sit in what we call that icky, sticky place and really begin to say, like, I'm going to sit here and work through this. I'm going to stay as I process this. And I think that's really missing from what I see as a therapist who works a lot with couples, because we just don't have that staying power anymore. Not that I would ever condone violence or a lack of safety. That's not what I'm saying here. But like, I think that our society is instant gratification. We've lost the ability to now try to find that next thing, that distraction, whatever that is. And so I'm learning that, and you're getting to witness that, which is something, gosh, I never had.
And I think going back to like, right, like as a society, like where we're going to, it can even get applied to like kids right now. Because kids right now in friendships, relationships, all of them, so weird to me, but they go straight to blocking people. There's no communication. There's no like resolution to it. It's, I'm going to block you. And then in 3 days, maybe I'll unblock you and we'll act like everything's fine, right? Which, how are parents showing up and how are they demonstrating things for their children, right? And then how are children learning how to communicate those things? So I just saw the parallel from what you just said.
Right.
So
And it reminds me of what we call intimacy in our work. And there's various types of intimacy, but I want to talk about the difference between emotional intimacy and physical intimacy. What you're just talking about is like the ability to sit with our emotions, the ability to sit with somebody else's emotions, the ability to be interested and curious in somebody else's emotional space. And you're right, it's not being activated in our society now, right? With video games and cell phones. I was watching a podcast the other day about what cell phones and AirPods are doing to AirPods are doing to our world, because we used to be able to, even if you wore headphones, be able to just have a conversation in the hallways and this sort of thing, and you're blocking out all noise now. So there's not even ability to have like a surface level conversation and check in, how's your day? What do? We like just kind of keep walking and hope they don't say anything to me kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing that we're generating. And we see this in relationships, right? We see it a little bit differently in relationships. And I'm going to talk from personal and professional experience for a minute, where we are almost like robots in relationships, programmed, right? We see and experience life and have imprints all over. I call them like Polaroid pictures inside of us, from what does it look like to fight with your partner? What does it look like to be friends? What does it look like to have a relationship with a daughter, son, or parent, grandparent? Those are all like imprinted in us, like stamped in us based on our experiences of what was modeled to us growing up. And even if we say things like, I don't want to be like my mom, I don't want to repeat this pattern, it's so familiar to us that it's more comfortable to us to become that person that it is to be something different. You actually have to fight really hard to be the exact opposite of what you don't want to become, right? Like, you have to try so hard and get so ingrained in therapy and self-work and whatever other things that you use to grow yourself. But most of the time we fall victim into that robotic thinking, and we become what we don't want to become, right? And so when we get into relationships, going to these places where we have these imprints and these stamps on us, and we are activated in a way that we bring out that robot in us. So if you're accustomed to fighting and your response is shut down, that's what you do in your relationships, right? And you can see this pattern across so many different, you pick the same partners because it's what's familiar. You pick the same friendships and you're like, what the heck's going on? Why is this the same issue everywhere I go, right? And a lot of times we don't even ask that question. We just kind of accept that that's what the normal is. But if any of our listeners, you, me, look at our intimate relationships, I can tell you there is a pattern, distinct pattern. Every one of my partners have very similar characteristics, right? And a lot of them are associated to my male figure growing up. And so some of the things that I've walked through, because I had a tolerance for it, right? Even though I said I never want this to be repeated in my life, I found myself, I negotiated with myself. I said things like, he's different, right? This looks different. And maybe pieces of it was different, but if we're really looking at the undertone of it, it was all very similar because it was familiar to me. And I showed up very familiar to how I saw my female figure in my life, my mom. And in our book, Unraveled Roots, my mom and I share our stories in that way because it's so similar. It's not even funny.
Yeah. And allowing space and taking a step back and actually looking at that, right? Because I'm sure so many people can relate. Like, if you actually paused, or you do a genogram, right, which we do in a lot of sessions with clients, and they might know some of these things, but then when you see a client like actually map it out, they're like, whoa, that's scary. Or, right, like, I'm just like my mom, or my relationship's just like this, and they're able to like piece it together. But you have to allow for space and curiosity and to get in the uncomfortable, to allow yourself to see those things, because it's so much easier to hide it or push it in the corner, not acknowledge it.
Yeah, and I'd love to expound on that, because I'm remembering a sex trafficking survivor that I was working on her genogram with her. It's a patterned behavior, family patterns, 3 generations, where you look at things like your strengths and your weaknesses, divorce, substance abuse, suicide, mental health issues, right? Creativeness, all of the things. And one of the things she marked was the number of partners she had, sexual partners. And as we were going through that, I could just see her entire body language shift. She was so shameful to put how many partners she had had. She had carried that weight around, and she didn't have a way through that. It just felt like she was the black sheep of the family. This was something that she was going to have to carry forever. It was what was wrong with her. Well, then we went to mom, and the question then came out, like, tell me about mom's dating history. Tell me about mom's intimate relationships. And all of a sudden, mom's list grew and grew and grew. And what happened is exactly what you said. I said, do you see the parallel there? And she's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. She's like, are you telling me I'm my mom? And I said, well, like, kind of, you know, like, yeah, you've repeated some of that familiar behavior. And instantly, Gal, and you see this in our sessions, but instantly, like, relief and that shame that she had been carrying, like, almost instantly went away, because she was like, oh. And then the question usually that I ask is, how did you know to be anything different?
Yeah, because, right, there's an accountability level for you. Once you're able to identify that, accept it, you have an option to put action behind it and choose something different for yourself. But then for them to be able to say, have some grace for themselves, to say, I didn't know any different, right? Like, I hate that this is where I'm at right now, but that's what was modeled to me for so long. How did I know anything different, right? Because when you're a child, right, you're defenseless. Like, you learn what you've been taught. So if what's being poured into you, right, isn't healthy, or that's not what you want, you have to get to a place to be able to identify and name, like, that's not okay, right? And that's hard when everything around you is saying that it is okay.
Right. And interesting, because what's coming up is, like, I always like to look at, like, the exact opposite, or the paradigm that shifts everything to another end. And I think of somebody who might be listening, or a client that I've had, like, my life was good. I never saw my parents argue, like, you know, and it's the parents that do maybe have self-control, and they do argue in their bedroom, or they don't argue at all, right? And so there's, like, this other side of it where you actively see the dysfunction, and then this other part of what we see in our office where you don't actively see the dysfunction, but you feel it in your body, right? And so a lot of times our clients will come in and they're like, my parents were great and nothing was wrong. There was nothing. And it's like, but your relationship today is dysfunctional. And so as a therapist, we get curious about that, because it's not likely that you're going to be in a dysfunctional relationship if you hadn't learned how to tolerate dysfunction, right? We see this passed on from generation. And so what we often do is explore what it looks like when you don't see arguing, what it looks like when people avoid conflict, what it looks like when you don't have a name for something. I prefer, as a therapist, that those clients that have seen that, because they can name it. The ones that are struggling behind it and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't really have anything. And then you start finding out, like, different scenarios, the extraction process starts to take place, but there's, like, this pushback because it's hard to accept, because, like, society has said, oh, that's great, your parents are still married, everything's great, you never saw them argue. Conflict is good when there's healing that takes place. And so when you believe that there's no such thing as conflict, well, then you become the quiet person in a relationship that tolerates things that maybe you don't really want to tolerate.
Yeah. There's, like, a middle ground, right? You don't want to be observing, or as, like, being in a relationship, you don't want to have conflict all the time. But also, if everything looks perfect all the time, right, how are you teaching your kids? Right. What breeding ground are you creating? Because, right, they're learning from you. So their image is that, oh, couples don't fight. You never have a disagreement. So then, you know, you get in a relationship and you have a problem, or you argue about finances, and it's like, whoa, this isn't allowed in a relationship. Like, you run away because you're like, I don't even know how to talk about this. That's right. You can't have a problem.
So good. And maybe then this is a great place to introduce attachment, because we do a lot of attachment work at Rooted Therapies, and I think it's really an amazing tool, an amazing understanding of what happens here. And so I always like to describe, there's 4 different types of attachment, but 3 main ones that I see in my office. And I like to kind of describe them very simplistically so people can understand it. It oversimplifies it, but I think it's worth it, right? There's secure attachment. And this is when I like to say the 2-year-old, mom has the 2-year-old, and they're going to the playground and they're going to play in the sandbox. And mom says, hey, we're going to play in the sandbox, and we're going to set you down and you're going to play with your friends. And the 2-year-old looks around, looks up at mom, makes sure everything's okay, looks back at the sandbox, and then goes on to play. Might look back a few times while mom's on the bench with the other parents or whatnot, but is able to integrate into that situation fairly seamlessly, right? They're making sure that they're connected to their caregiver that they trust and love, and that their caregiver can trust and love them back. And so if you can build that relationship with your primary caregiver, you are likely going to find a healthy relationship moving through life. I mean, other things could shape that if you have other things that happen. But what we primarily see at Rooted, and you see with the kids' parents that you serve or their caregivers, is insecure, anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. And those are they're attracted to each other. It's not ever likely, right, that you're going to have a secure, attached person with avoidant or with an insecure, right? Because in order for a dysfunctional relationship to exist, you need somebody who's willing to clean up the mess and somebody who's willing to make it, right? Because they don't work the other way. Because if this person needs to be cleaning up messes to feel connected, well, they need a mess maker. And if you're a mess maker, you don't like to clean things up. And so you're going to get yourself in a pretty bad situation unless you find somebody that cleans up your messes and enables you. So that's where insecure or anxious and avoidant attached. And so going back to the sandbox analogy, my clients really relate to this, is the insecure or anxious attached child. Mom says, we're going to the playground, we're going to do the sandbox thing. And they get to the sandbox and mom gets ready to drop the child off in the sandbox, and she clings or he clings on with dear life and starts having a meltdown, right? And will not let herself or himself go to the sandbox. No matter how much mom says or whatever, there's an outward expression of pain. And what that's saying is, I don't trust myself. I need you, caregiver, to fix this problem for myself. And so they become incredibly dependent on people, places, and things to fill that space inside of them that we want to teach children to fill on their own, right? Through a healthy attachment with a caregiver. And the avoidant attachment, right? Child goes to the playground, same scenario. Mom gets ready to drop them off in the sandbox, and that avoidant gets in the sandbox, but what neurological science has taught us is they are having the same reaction that anxious child is having, except it's inward, right? And so everything is firing. I'm not safe. But unless you have an eye for it, you wouldn't know it. Because they're just going to sit there in the sandbox and they're going to avoid connecting with that caregiver, because that caregiver at some point has said, I'm not a safe person. I'm not going to fill your needs. You've got to find a way to fill it yourself. And so they sit there and they tolerate that incredible discomfort, all of that ding, 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 like this isn't what I want. It's just inside and not outside. And so what they begin to learn is, I have to fix everything on my own. I have to be the one that carries everything on my shoulders. And I can't trust a single person in this world. And so you can see, if you translate that to adolescence, if you translate that to young adult life, if you translate that to my life, right? Anyone's life, it becomes very, very dysfunctional, because now you have somebody who is seeking somebody else to fill their cup, right? And you have the other person who doesn't trust, right? And is inside of themselves. And a lot of times avoidants use alcohol, drugs, food, video games, whatever it is, to distract. And so that's often what we see coming into our office, which I feel like is super important for people to understand in relationships. So if we know it comes from those mirrors or those imprints from childhood, and then this is how we act it out, it's no wonder that sex has become the singular place that we transaction with relationship, because it's become an object of connection, not emotional intimacy. Huge issue in our offices, right? And
and I just think that was like a great analogy, right? I've heard you use it before, but like for other people, like the first time they've ever heard it, maybe the first time they've even heard of attachment, maybe even reflecting on like how is your attachment style? How is your partner's attachment style, right? And I think using that space like for a few moments, like just to really explore what that is for you and what that looks like in your relationship, or even go online and look it up a little bit, do a little bit of a deeper dive, because it really does affect how you operate in life so much. And it's okay if you're anxious. It's okay if you're avoidant. I would say a lot of people aren't secure, and that's okay, but it's learning how to live with it, right, and how to combat it, and knowing how you operate, and how to learn to grow from it.
Absolutely. And really important to identify it, because you don't have to live in the dysfunction, right? And that's what maybe you witnessed. If we're going to go back to the story over Christmas with Dad and I, you witnessed that, because I tend to, even in my healing journey, find myself in that insecure space, that anxious space, and Dad is very much in his avoidance space, especially when we're like trying to fight for our space, right? And so both of us leaning in towards each other is what you're watching us do now. Dad's really uncomfortable because he's not avoiding, which is a big deal for him, and I'm trying to be more open to trusting myself, right? And not needing him to fill my space, so together we can come to a healthy place. It's like a bridge, right? I want to sit in my space if I'm my healthy, secure self. I want dad to sit in his place, or you, or whoever else I'm in relationship, and we build a bridge and create something together. I don't have to abandon myself for the avoidant behavior, and the avoidant needs to lean in to something different too, because otherwise they are very isolated and emotionally tuned off.
Right. Learning how to like be your full, whole, healthy self, right? Because until you can, like, coming together, right, you are, like, feeding off of each other, looking for each other for fulfillment in certain things.
It's absolutely true.
And I know that, like, you've struggled with, like, codependency, right? Or that's been, like, a journey you've worked through. So you shared something on social media a few days ago about unconditional love, and I feel like there is an element in today's society where people feel like that's what they're searching for like unconditional love, and they want that, or that's what movies portray or books portray, and there's a parallel, like, to some degree about unconditional love and codependency, and I saw something even, like, challenging that, like, an unconditional loving relationship should truly only be with, like your child and you, and even challenged when your child reaches the age of adulthood, they could be a jerk, right? Or they could go through their own dysfunction, and then to some degree the unconditional love doesn't necessarily follow through at that point, right? You have to instill boundaries and different things in your relationship. Doesn't mean that you don't love them, but that you respect yourself, right? And that there are conditions to relationships. You do want to be treated well. Doesn't mean somebody has to bring you flowers every day, right? But that they deserve to treat you with respect, right? Or abide by certain boundaries you have, or different things like that. So I don't know if there was anything you wanted to, like, speak to on that.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So codependency, I think it's really important to name that. It's the addiction to people, places, or things. So just like a alcoholic or a substance user needs the substance to numb, right? Codependents need a person, a place, or a thing to validate them, to show them love, to tell them who they are. And that's the way that they distract themselves from themselves. And so, codependents are often anxious, attached individuals who look to the outside world for affirmation, for love, for whatever those things are. And so you're right. I have struggled with codependency for most of my life. I still do. And I didn't know what it was until I was facing my first divorce and was, like, asking all these questions about how did this happen, and just getting really curious. And what I found out is I was attracted to people who needed me, because that helped me feel like I was important, I was loved, right? And so I learned very early on to set myself aside, that I wasn't valuable, I wasn't worth it, I wasn't enough. And so I began putting other people in those kind of places so that I didn't have to look inside those painful places inside of me, right? I did not trust myself. I trusted everybody else. And I've gotten really hurt as a result of putting my trust and my needs into other people, because I have chosen people who don't know how to, and they never were supposed to, hold those things well. Right? And so going back to that unconditional love, I never learned how to unconditionally love myself. Right? In my dysfunction, in my spaces and places, I never saw what that looked like, and I never got to feel that experience. And so it wasn't until almost my third decade of life that I started to understand that there was a different way. And it's been 12 years of me trying to understand what it looks like to love yourself and have an unconditional experience with yourself. And that's really hard when you've been conditioned to believe something very different. So all of that to say that I haven't known how to love well for most of my life until I started learning to love myself. Could I then really love other people, right? And that's because I didn't need their love anymore. I wanted it, or I enjoyed it. I didn't need it. So today, sitting in front of you, I'm a very different woman, but that wasn't always my story. So it's a lot to unpack about what is unconditional love and how do you express unconditional love. Yeah, there is a specific bond with a biological child that we do know exists, and that unconditional love, because children, when you're biologically connected, sometimes you feel like they can't do anything wrong. Mm-hmm. There's like no conditions on the love you have for them. Mm-hmm. But I even would be mindful of that too, because not every parent-child relationship feels like that, depending on how healthy or unhealthy the family is.
Mm-hmm. I think going off of that even, right, when you see somebody that exits a relationship, right, and doesn't work on themselves at all, and they find themselves entering another romantic relationship right after and just continuing to do that, right, that shows sometimes, right, that they aren't able to look inwards or love themselves mm-hmm. or be happy or content with themselves, and sit in that uncomfortable and say, like, how did I show up wrong in this relationship? Mm-hmm. Or how did this other person show up wrong? Because reality is, when they, most of the time, right, jump into another relationship, they're just repeating the same unhealthy behaviors. Yeah. Because there's no reflection. There's no time for it, mm-hmm. right? They just want to feel loved or feel all these things, because in that moment, that, like, rupture that they had through that relationship destroyed them, mm-hmm. and they can't sit in it. And, right, if they feel unloved or all these negative thought processes that are going through their head, right, mm-hmm. easier to flee from it than to sit in it.
Yeah. And if you're using a relationship to meet your own needs, mm-hmm. I would encourage anyone listening to really explore that, because mm-hmm. that's not what relationships are for, mm-hmm. right? Relationships are for shared experiences, for companionship, mm-hmm. for engaging in new meaning and curiosity, but it's not so that you fill me and I fill you. Mm-hmm. That's not what relationships are. And unfortunately, that's often what we see in here, is that, well, if he does this, then I'll do that. Or if she does this, then I'll do this. Mm-hmm. And that's just never going to work in a relationship that is healthy and full, mm-hmm. which goes back to the original conversation about emotional intimacy, and often what I counsel clients around is, like, sex has become the only way to connect. Mm-hmm. And it's at 40 years old, after you've had sex for as long as you have, it loses its zeal because there's no emotional intimacy behind it, right? Mm-hmm. Men's testosterone are going down. Women no longer can tolerate maybe some of the experiences because they're going through different changes. And so they come into my office going, it's just not the same anymore. We're not 25 anymore, and things are different, and our kids are aging, and there's a lot of changes happening. Mm-hmm. And what they're learning is that in order to continue growing, they need to find that emotionally mm-hmm. intimate space, because that physical transaction is no longer doing it for mm-hmm. them. And some people don't realize that, because they believe that sex is the only mechanism of connection.
Do you feel like when you reach that place with couples, when they come into your office and you're kind of like, okay, like, sex necessarily isn't the problem here, right? It's your emotional connection with each other. Do you feel like they, like, flee away from that? Or do you ever, like, start working on that with them? And they're like, oh, yes. That's way too scary. Mm. I like it being a sex problem and not an emotional problem.
Yeah. I think that it depends on the client's ability to, some are, like, really shy and turn bright red because sex is just like that 4-letter word that nobody talks about. Mm-hmm. Or they're really wide open because they do want a different experience. Mm-hmm. And that a lot of times it's like there's so much underneath the surface that neither partner has explored that they don't even understand. And as they begin to be able to put a name to things, it's all of a sudden it takes a different shape, and there's like, oh, that's what that could be. Oh yeah. Oh. And that sometimes is really relieving for clients to have something to hold on to and realize, like, okay, there's a way through this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I feel like obviously we're therapists, mm-hmm. so we're a little biased, but I think, like, for you to just say, right, you're having, like, 40, 50, 6-year-old clients, because sometimes, like, coming in with these issues, like, knowing, like, how beneficial it can be for just yourself, not even necessarily your relationship as a couple, right, if you're in one, but for yourself to start, like, exploring what that looks like and bettering yourself. And sometimes it's hard to do that on your own, and being able to have somebody like a therapist, right, or a mentor mm-hmm. to explore those things, you can know yourself so much more, so that when you do enter your next relationship, you can be a little bit more curious about some things, or mm-hmm. grow and enter into something that's completely different than, like, the patterns that you've been following.
Yeah. And I would switch the tables back to you to say, you've done a lot of your own growth, but not until you get into a relationship and have that mirror facing back to you will you get to do even greater growth.
Yes.
So to your point, absolutely. Individual healing is so important. But when you enter relationships, I think people think, well, I've arrived. I'm going to have the greatest relationship. Oftentimes, if you're working through your own dysfunction, it's in relationships that we find the greatest amount of growth, because it's as if you're wearing a mirror on your heart and me on mine, and we can then see ourselves differently than what we can see when we're just looking in the mirror ourselves.
Yeah. And right, like therapy, part of it, right, is exploring those things, but part of it is talking and learning those things, but then putting it in action in the real world, and then going back to therapy and being like, okay, I really messed up, or this went great. And like even for myself, like I graduated from therapy, right, and my therapist was like, when you choose to start dating again, she was like, you need to come back and see me, right? Because I've done some of the, and right, like that doesn't mean I can't go back before then, but I've done some of the individual work, right? But reality is when I enter another relationship, things are going to come up for me, or I'm going to need to explore some things, right? And that's okay. And like you said, right, because when you put it into action, like more things are going to come up, or as you're playing things out and exploring what that looks like.
Absolutely, girl. And so I would encourage anyone, right, that's facing adversity to, if they aren't in an unsafe situation and there does look to be like there could be a pathway forward, that they seek counsel in whatever that looks like. And I want you to persevere, because there's so much to learn through that resistance. Again, if you're unsafe, or the relationship is violent, or you're around the mountain for the 15th time on a cheating situation, or pornography, or DUI, or these sort of things, we need to know when the boundary needs to exist, and that's a whole nother podcast, right? But if you're facing resistance because you're looking at a partner who doesn't have qualities that you want, or you don't feel like you're able to show up, or whatever, communication is oftentimes a big thing for a lot of our couples. Like, sit in it, get the support you need, and see if you can learn about yourself and start growing together.
So, going back a little bit, right, you said, like that argument that you and Dad had over Christmas, like you said, we have different tools now to be able to use. So, right, like through being in this marriage for a while, right, like your tool belt's grown as as a couple together, right, and individually. So, what do you feel like's changed? Like, what do you feel like in your marriage has allowed you to have healthier communication, or to overcome some struggles when it comes to kids, finance, or the nuances of life and what it throws at you? Like, what do you feel like going back to your first year of marriage to now, what's changed for you guys?
Yeah, we both changed. The information that I'm toggling in my brain is this statistic that says, and I think it's from the Gottman Institute, that 64% of arguments in relationships never get resolved. Say that again, because when I heard that, I'm like, what? More than half of the arguments that happen in relationships never get resolved, and they're not supposed to. And what I now understand about that, to your point, is that I'm not in a relationship with somebody who is my puppet, and vice versa, right? Your dad is not my puppet. He is his own individual soul. He's his own individual person with his own individual thoughts, and I am too. And so we aren't always going to see the world the same way. It's learning to respect and appreciate each other's life experiences. And wow, it's emotional. I have a compassion and understanding for your dad that I never, ever did. And the things he's had to journey through, and the hard things that he's had to walk through, I don't want to ever enable those things, because he has to do his work to walk that journey out. But I can offer part of myself now to say, I can see why that looks that way to you, or I can appreciate why that makes you really angry. What he might not have told you is, when we were on that mountain shooting your grandfather's gun, who he died 8 years ago, your dad was going through it, right? Like, that was the first time he had shot that gun since Pa died, and he just didn't have the emotional capacity when he couldn't find his wallet that day to navigate the big emotions that had already been underneath the surface. It wasn't okay that he took it out on me, but after the conversation, his awareness, my ability to believe and trust that he is reflecting in his own way allowed me to say, like, God, that must have been really hard for you. Please don't ever talk to me that way again. But man, I can see. And so I would say that that's probably in that 64%, right? Like, he might act that way again, and it's not okay, because that's his anger and he has to learn how to work that out. But I don't have to see that situation the same as him, but I can appreciate what he was carrying that day. And I think he could say the same thing about me, that, like, oh my gosh, Lisa, your dad yelled at you about everything growing up, and he was always saying words like that to you. Like, I can see why you got so irate about that too. So I would say that's probably what has changed in our relationship. And the willingness. I trust your dad to do the work now. There was a time that I didn't know that he really cared enough, right? And I was so worried about what he was doing every single day that he felt so micromanaged. That's not our relationship anymore, right? He's shown me that he wants to do the work. He wants to be in this relationship, and I trust myself to be able to navigate the circumstances around our relationship to say, I see him doing the work. He went to therapy that week, right? He did a lot of things to make adjustments to walk through all that disorganization inside of him.
And I think, like, what a cool, like, experience to kind of give as an example and have real emotions through it too, and show that, like, you and dad, right, even though dad's more of avoidant, like, he was able to feel safe enough, even in the moment, right, that his anger takes a hold of him. Afterwards, he's able to reflect and show up, right, and say, like, this is what was happening for me, right, and for you to be a safe space for him, right, after all the emotions have calmed down and, you know, you're acting on your emotions, you're in control of them, to be able to be like, wow, that has to be really hard, and hold that space for him to then feel like, wow, like, she hears me, or like she cares, or right, there's a space there, and then vice versa, right, for you to say like this, and then for him to say like, oh, that had to be really hard, and I'm showing up how your dad was showing up for you, and I see how you reacted that way, right, and just to see, like, that's what love looks like, right? It's hard sometimes, but being able to work through the hard, and that there is dysfunction within it, and our past affects our future relationships, right? And sometimes we're triggered by things that we don't even know, right? Like you just said, like, your dad used to yell at you all the time as a kid, right? If you aren't self-aware, or you don't allow to, like, explore yourself, you might never know that, right? You might get in a relationship and have someone that lets out their feelings through anger and get really loud, and you might shut down or act out, or however you choose to respond, and not even know, right? That's where the parallel is. But when you're able to identify the parallel, then you can say, like, okay, like, I can learn to change this, right? Or show up differently, because you're being triggered, essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe if, as a closing thought, I feel like maybe somebody's listening and is in a relationship situation, and this meets them where they are, but for a parent who has maybe mirrored unhealthy experiences and feels like they're, you know, there's no way out of it. Cal, I feel like although things have been dysfunctional at times in our relationship, there's something really beautiful that has happened inside of you that, I mean, we still got to see how this transforms you or transpires in your future with your next partner. But there's a piece of you that I feel like you could leave our listeners with that might maybe give them hope, or maybe just some words of encouragement that, like, it's not, there's always room to continue or improve or connect with their children. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, like, obviously, like, I'm a single girl. I'm in my single era. But I think I have been modeled dysfunction from multiple different, like, grown-ups or parents or grandparents or whomever in my life. But I do have a lot of self-awareness. But I'm also, I've been allowed, like, into your relationship in a way that your business isn't my business. And there's a difference between, like, there's there's things that should be kept between spouses and your kids. But then also you've opened and allowed a door to be open for me to learn from your and dad's mistakes. And I think that has been a really good blessing for me, and I'm really grateful for it, because sometimes when kids are left to their own defenses, right, depending if they avoid or they're anxious, but their minds could go in different places. Mm-hmm. But sometimes, like, I remember when I was younger, I would be like, okay, I see them argue, mm-hmm. and then I see they're fine 2 days later, and I'm mad because I'm like, that wasn't okay, or that was such a huge, colossal thing that happened, and that, like, was a lot for me and draining, and now it's fine. But now being able to kind of hear some of those things, like for me to hear what that fight was and now be old enough to know what that looked like underneath and see the deeper reasons, it allows me to know when I enter another relationship or I have a friendship and maybe somebody gets activated, like allowing to hold space, not that how they treated me was okay, right? And setting that boundary and setting that intention. I'm not okay with that, right? But then allowing to be like, what's really going on, mm-hmm. right? They have to be able to be vulnerable too, right? But you're allowed to get to a deeper space with that. And I think that if you're modeling dysfunctional things to your kids, you're human, you're gonna do it. There's no parent that's perfect, but being able to have developmentally appropriate conversations depending on what age your kid is and be able to hold that space and say, like, I messed up, or your dad messed up, and let's have some conversations about this, because then you're modeling what it truly looks like and what the repair looks like to a big argument. Mm-hmm. Or that wasn't okay that I treated your mom that way and I didn't show up the best way. You're teaching them those things, and instead of letting them just let their imagination run, mm-hmm. and develop what they think is right for themselves because they're a kid. Mm-hmm. And what they're going to develop isn't necessarily right. And you have the opportunity to really guide their thought process. So if you mess up as a parent, it's okay. Mm-hmm. But then learning that you can rewrite that path if you choose to, instead of just wiping your hands and saying, oh, that happened, I don't want to revisit it, and I definitely don't want to get vulnerable with my kids and revisit it. It's hard. Right. Life's hard. Relationships mm-hmm. are hard.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So it's never too late to change, both inside yourself and for your family, mm-hmm. and the relationships you're in.